Every morning, she left milk and bread for an elderly woman on the church steps, silent and guilty, until the Duke ordered her to stop, and revealed he'd been watching for weeks. The morning fog clung to the cobblestones like a secret the city wasn't ready to tell. Sarah Miller pulled her thin coat closer, the worn fabric offering little protection against the October chill that seemed to seep through everything. Her clothes, her resolve, the careful distance she maintained from the world. Her footsteps echoed softly in the emptiness, a rhythm she had perfected over the past month. Purposeful enough to belong, quiet enough to disappear. The basket pressed against her ribs with familiar weight. Bread wrapped in her grandmother's faded kitchen towel, a small bottle of milk that had cost more than she could afford, and beneath it all, the persistent ache of a choice she couldn't quite explain to herself. Every morning she told herself it would be the last time. Every morning she found herself walking the same path. The square stretched before her like a stage waiting for actors who never came. The fountain at its center had run dry years ago, leaving only the bronze angels to watch over a basin filled with fallen leaves and forgotten coins. The church rose beyond it, its stone facade darkened by decades of weather and neglect, though the doors still opened for those who needed shelter, or absolution. Sarah had stopped believing in absolution after David died. What she believed in now was smaller, more tangible. The weight of bread in her hands, the way kindness could exist without explanation, the possibility that invisible people might still cast shadows if someone bothered to look. She paused at the edge of the square, scanning the familiar scene with the careful attention of someone who had learned that safety lived in the details. The bakery on the corner showed warm light in its windows, Monsieur Laurent preparing for the day's first customers. The newspaper stand remained shuttered, its owner never appearing before 7. The bench near the fountain sat empty as it always did at this hour, too exposed for anyone seeking true shelter. But the church steps offered something different. Not sanctuary exactly, but shadow. A place where someone could exist without demanding attention, where the space between visibility and complete erasure created room for survival. She was there again. The elderly woman occupied the same position she had claimed for weeks now, not on the main steps where worshippers would pass, but tucked into the corner where the side wall met the foundation. Her body seemed to fold inward, shoulders curved to make herself smaller, hands clasped not in prayer but in the universal gesture of someone trying to hold their pieces together. The gray shawl that covered her head had faded to the color of morning mist, making her appear less like a person and more like a natural part of the stone itself. Sarah had never seen her face clearly. The woman kept her head bowed with the discipline of someone who had learned that eye contact could be dangerous, that being truly seen might bring consequences worse than being ignored. But Sarah had memorized other details. The careful way she arranged her worn skirt to cover her legs, the precision with which she positioned herself to catch the first rays of sun when they finally broke through the church's shadow, the absolute stillness that suggested she had mastered the art of taking up no more space than absolutely necessary. The first time Sarah had seen her, 3 weeks ago, she had intended only to pass by. She was late for work, Noah needed new shoes they couldn't afford, and getting involved in anyone else's trouble seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. But something about the woman's stillness had stopped her. Not the dramatic stillness of performance or protest, but the profound quiet of someone who had learned that invisibility was a form of protection. Sarah had walked past that first morning, but the image had followed her through the day. During her lunch break, sitting alone in the office break room, she had found herself thinking about hunger, not the ordinary hunger of missing a meal, but the deeper kind that came from being forgotten by the world. That evening, as she wrapped Noah's leftover sandwich for the next day's lunch, she had found herself cutting the bread a little thicker, packing a little extra. The second morning, she had left the sandwich on the step beside where the woman sat. No words, no eye contact, no ceremony. Just bread wrapped in clean cloth, placed carefully within reach. She had walked away without looking back, her heart hammering with the strange fear that comes from crossing lines you didn't know existed. When she returned the next morning, the cloth had been folded neatly and left on the step. Empty but respectfully returned. The routine had developed its own language, a careful choreography of approach and withdrawal that required no words. Sarah would arrive as the church bells chimed 6:30, her footsteps deliberately audible on the cobblestones so the woman would know she was coming. She would place the small offering on the worn stone step, neither too close nor too far, and retreat to a respectful distance before continuing on her way to work. The woman never acknowledged her presence directly, but Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of acceptance. The slight shift in posture when she approached, the way weathered fingers would eventually reach for what had been left, the careful preservation of the cloth wrappings that appeared each morning, folded with a precision that spoke of gratitude too deep for words. It should have felt simple. It should have remained invisible, this small exchange between two people who understood what it meant to exist at the margins. But Sarah had forgotten that in a town like theirs, even shadows cast attention when they fell in the wrong places. The first sign came on a Thursday morning, when Mrs. Henderson from the bakery lingered too long at her window as Sarah passed. The second came when Father Miguel emerged from the church earlier than usual, his gaze following Sarah's path with an expression she couldn't quite read. By Friday, she noticed that the woman had positioned herself further back, deeper into the shadow, as if some instinct had warned her that their careful invisibility was beginning to crack. Sarah told herself she was imagining things. Small towns bred gossip the way damp basements bred mold. It was inevitable, mostly harmless, and usually moved on to more interesting subjects within a week. But as she sat at her desk in the municipal building, filing permits and processing applications with mechanical precision, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The work was steady but unremarkable, the kind of job that paid just enough to keep her and Noah housed and fed, but not enough for anything that might be called security. She had held the position for 3 years, ever since David's accident had left her scrambling to rebuild their life from pieces that never quite fit together the same way. Her supervisor, Mr. Crawford, was a decent man who appreciated punctuality and competence, and who had never made her feel like charity case, even when they both knew her salary barely covered her expenses. But that Friday she caught him watching her with an expression she recognized from her marriage, the careful attention men gave to women when they suspected secrets but weren't sure whether to be concerned or suspicious. "Everything all right, Sarah?" he asked during the afternoon lull, his tone casual but his eyes too focused. "You seem distracted lately." The question was reasonable, even kind, but it landed in her chest like a stone in still water, sending ripples through her carefully maintained composure. "Just tired," she said, managing a smile that felt like it belonged to someone else. Noah had a rough night. It wasn't entirely a lie. Noah had been having rough nights for months. Nightmares about his father, anxiety about money he was too young to understand but old enough to sense. But Crawford's nod felt too knowing, as if he had expected that answer, had perhaps been waiting for it. That evening, as she prepared dinner in the small kitchen that smelled permanently of the lavender soap she used to mask the apartment's underlying dampness, Sarah found herself cataloging the day's small wrongnesses. The way conversations had stopped when she entered rooms. The pointed politeness of colleagues who usually offered casual warmth. The sensation of being observed that had followed her home like an unwelcome shadow. Noah chatted about his school day while they ate, his 7-year-old enthusiasm temporarily pushing away her anxieties. He told her about the science project on weather patterns, about the girl in his class who had brought a hamster for show and tell, about the upcoming school carnival that would require a costume she wasn't sure they could afford. She listened with the fierce attention of a mother who knew that these moments of ordinary childhood were precious and fragile, that the world had too many ways of stealing them. After he was asleep, she sat by the window that overlooked the square, watching the empty streets and trying to understand what she had started. The bread and milk were such small things, acts of basic human decency that shouldn't require explanation or justification. But she was beginning to understand that in their town, built on the careful architecture of who belonged and who didn't, even small kindnesses could be seen as disruptions. The woman's face haunted her thoughts. She realized she had been thinking of her as the woman or the elderly lady, never as a person with a name, a history, a life that had led her to those church steps. The anonymity had felt respectful, a way of offering help without demanding intimacy. But now Sarah wondered if it was something else, a way of keeping her own involvement distant, manageable, less real. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with a kind of persistent drizzle that made everything look abandoned. Sarah prepared the usual offering, bread, milk, and today an apple from the tree in their building's tiny courtyard that would probably be the last of the season. As she wrapped everything in the familiar cloth, she made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. She would speak to her. Not to ask questions or demand explanations, but simply to acknowledge what had grown between them. To transform their silent exchange into something more honest, even if it was more dangerous. The square was emptier than usual, the weather having driven away even the early risers. The woman sat in her customary place, but something about her posture seemed different. More alert, more tense, as if she too sensed that their careful equilibrium was about to shift. Sarah approached slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She placed the cloth bundle on the step as always, but instead of immediately retreating, she remained standing, searching for words that might bridge the gap between stranger and human being without violating the trust they had built in silence. "Good morning," she said quietly, the words feeling both simple and revolutionary. The woman's head lifted slightly, just enough for Sarah to catch a glimpse of eyes that held depths she hadn't expected. Intelligence, wariness, and something that might have been surprise. For a moment that stretched like held breath, they looked at each other across a distance measured not in feet but in the accumulated weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. Then the woman nodded once, barely perceptible, before lowering her gaze again. The nod lingered in Sarah's mind throughout the weekend like an echo in an empty church. Such a small gesture, barely more than a tilt of the head, yet it had transformed everything. What had been an anonymous exchange of necessity now carried the weight of recognition, of two people who had seen each other and chosen to continue anyway. Monday morning brought rain that drummed against her apartment windows with unusual persistence, as if the weather itself was trying to deliver a message she wasn't ready to hear. Noah complained about walking to school in the downpour, and Sarah found herself making excuses to delay their departure, checking and rechecking his backpack, fussing over his raincoat until he gave her the patient look that was becoming too familiar, the expression of a child learning to manage an anxious parent. By the time she reached the square, the rain had softened to a fine mist that seemed to hang in the air rather than fall. The church steps glistened with dampness and she expected to find them empty. Even the most desperate had their limits, and sitting in the cold rain seemed beyond what anyone should have to endure. But the woman was there, pressed further back under the narrow overhang that provided minimal shelter. The gray shawl was pulled tight around her shoulders, and Sarah could see she was shivering, not the dramatic trembling of performance, but the deep, bone-level cold of someone whose body no longer generated enough heat to keep up with what it was losing. The sight hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been so focused on the careful choreography of their interaction that she had forgotten this was about survival, not symbolism. Whatever complicated feelings she had about being watched or whispered about suddenly seemed trivial compared to the simple fact that another human being was suffering from cold in a world that had plenty of warm places for those who knew how to claim them. Without fully deciding, she found herself approaching more directly than usual. "You must be freezing," she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency she hadn't intended. The woman looked up more fully this time, and Sarah was startled by what she saw. The face was deeply lined but not ancient, marked more by hardship than by age. The eyes that met hers held a sharp intelligence that cut through any assumptions about helplessness or confusion. This was not someone who had lost her way through age or illness. This was someone who had been deliberately placed outside the boundaries of ordinary life. "I'm fine," the woman said, her voice rusty from disuse but clear. The words carried an accent Sarah couldn't place. Something European, perhaps, or Eastern European, softened by years but still distinct. The response surprised Sarah more than silence would have. There was dignity in it, even defiance. This was not the voice of someone broken by circumstances, but of someone enduring them with full awareness of what she was accepting. "My name is Sarah," she said, sitting down on the step despite the dampness seeping through her coat. "I live just across the square in the building with the blue shutters." The woman studied her for a long moment, as if weighing risks Sarah couldn't begin to calculate. "Anna," she said finally. "Anna Kowalski." The name hit Sarah with unexpected force. Not because she recognized it, but because it made everything real in a way that anonymous kindness never had to be. Anna was not just the woman on the church steps anymore. She was a person with a history, with choices that had led her here, with reasons that Sarah was suddenly desperate to understand. "Anna," Sarah repeated, testing the weight of it. "Have you been? I mean, how long have you been coming here?" Something shifted in Anna's expression, a flicker of what might have been amusement or might have been sadness. "Longer than you have been bringing me breakfast," she said. "But not so long that I have forgotten what it feels like to choose where I sit." The answer carried layers Sarah didn't know how to unpack. There was history in it, complexity that suggested this wasn't just about homelessness or bad luck. Anna's careful English, her precise way of speaking, the indefinable sense of education that clung to her despite her circumstances, all of it pointed to a story that didn't fit the simple narrative Sarah had been constructing. "I should let you go," Anna said, glancing toward the clock tower that showed Sarah would be late for work if she didn't leave soon. "You have been kind, but kindness has consequences here. More than you might know." The warning sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the weather. "What do you mean?" Anna's gaze drifted toward the buildings surrounding the square, taking in the windows that might hide watching eyes, the doorways that could shelter interested observers. "This is a small place," she said. Small places have long memories and short patience for things that don't fit their understanding of how the world should work. Are you in some kind of trouble? Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the question was too simple for the complexity she was sensing. Trouble, Anna repeated as if testing the word's adequacy. I suppose that is one way to describe it. Though I prefer to think of it as existing inconveniently. Before Sarah could ask what that meant, the sound of footsteps on wet cobblestones made them both turn. A man in a dark coat was crossing the square with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged wherever he chose to go. He wasn't looking in their direction, wasn't obviously interested in their conversation, but something about his presence made Anna's entire body tense. You should go, Anna said quietly, urgency replacing the philosophical tone she had taken moments before. Go now and do not look back. Sarah felt the command in her bones, the kind of instant obedience that comes from recognizing real danger even when you don't understand its source. She stood quickly, her mind scrambling to process what had just happened, what she had stumbled into by offering bread and milk to someone she had assumed was simply hungry. As she walked away, forcing herself to maintain a normal pace, she could feel the weight of attention following her. Not just Anna's gaze but something else, a presence that seemed to take note of her departure, her timing, her connection to the woman she was leaving behind. By the time she reached the municipal building, Sarah's hands were shaking, and it had nothing to do with the cold. The morning's encounter replayed in Sarah's mind with obsessive clarity as she attempted to focus on the day's work. Every detail felt significant now, the way Anna had spoken with such careful precision, the transformation that had come over her when the man in the dark coat appeared, the specific word she had chosen, inconveniently. People weren't inconvenient by accident. They became inconvenient when they knew things or represented things that powerful people preferred to keep buried. Sarah's hands trembled as she processed a stack of building permits, the mundane bureaucracy of small-town life suddenly feeling like a thin veneer over something much more complicated. She found herself glancing repeatedly at the window that overlooked the square, though from her third-floor desk she could only see the fountain and the corner of the church. Anna remained invisible from this distance, but her presence seemed to permeate the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be located. At lunch, instead of eating the sandwich she had packed, Sarah found herself walking the long way around the square, taking a route that would let her observe the church steps without appearing to do so directly. The area looked normal, a few tourists taking pictures of the old architecture, an elderly man feeding pigeons near the fountain, the usual quiet rhythm of a town where nothing ever seemed to happen. But Anna was gone. The empty space where she usually sat created an absence so profound that Sarah felt it like a misstep in the dark. The stone showed no evidence that anyone had ever been there, no impression, no forgotten belongings, no trace of the woman who had occupied that corner with such careful precision for weeks. Sarah's rational mind suggested reasonable explanations. Anna had sought shelter from the rain. She had found a warmer place to spend the day. She had simply chosen a different location, one that offered better protection from whatever dangers she had sensed in the square that morning. But Sarah's instincts, sharpened by 3 years of single motherhood and economic uncertainty, whispered darker possibilities. The timing of Anna's disappearance, so soon after their first real conversation, felt like more than coincidence. The warning Anna had given her, about kindness having consequences, about small towns and long memories, suddenly seemed less like gentle advice and more like a prediction coming true. That afternoon, Mr. Crawford appeared at her desk with an expression she had never seen before. Not angry exactly, but troubled in a way that suggested complications beyond the usual office politics. "Sarah," he said, perching on the edge of her desk with the casual familiarity of someone trying to soften whatever he was about to say. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know it's not coming from me personally." The phrasing sent alarm bells through her nervous system. In her experience, conversations that began with disclaimers about personal feelings never ended well. "What is it?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "There have been some observations about your morning routine," Crawford said, clearly uncomfortable with the words he was speaking. "Nothing official, you understand. Just people noticing patterns, asking questions about whether municipal employees should be involving themselves in certain situations." Sarah felt the careful architecture of her life beginning to shift, like a building settling on unstable ground. "I don't understand what you mean by situations." Crawford sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, Sarah, I know you're a good person. Whatever you've been doing, I'm sure your intentions are nothing but generous. But there are people in this town who believe that some problems are better left unaddressed. that trying to help certain individuals can create more difficulties than it solves. The euphemisms were so careful, so deliberately vague, that Sarah realized she was being given an official warning disguised as a friendly conversation. Someone had been watching her interactions with Anna. Someone had decided those interactions represented a problem that needed managing. "Are you asking me to stop helping someone who's hungry?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I'm asking you to consider whether the kind of help you're offering is really helping anyone," Crawford replied. "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is allow people to find their own solutions in their own time, without drawing attention that might make their situations more complicated." Sarah stared at him, reading between the lines of his careful language. Someone with enough influence to make Crawford uncomfortable, had identified her small acts of kindness as a problem that needed to be eliminated. Not through direct confrontation or legal action, but through the subtler pressure of social disapproval and economic vulnerability. "I understand," she said finally, though what she understood was far more complex than Crawford probably intended. "Good," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I knew you would. You're smart, Sarah. You know how to take care of yourself and Noah. That's what matters most." The mention of Noah's name hit her like a slap. It was gentle, almost protective in its phrasing, but the message was unmistakable. Her actions had consequences that extended beyond herself. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where her job was a lifeline she couldn't afford to lose, where Noah's security depended on her ability to remain invisible and compliant, even small acts of defiance carried enormous risks. After Crawford left, Sarah sat staring at her computer screen without seeing it. The words blurred together as she tried to process what had just happened. She had been warned off, politely, indirectly, but unmistakably. Her morning routine, her small offerings of food, her moment of human connection with Anna, had been identified as a threat to something or someone important enough to mobilize official pressure. But the warning raised more questions than it answered. If Anna was simply a homeless woman, why would helping her require this kind of intervention? Why would feeding someone generate enough concern to reach Sarah's workplace? What was it about Anna's presence, or Sarah's assistance, that threatened whatever careful balance the town's power structure was trying to maintain? The questions multiplied through the afternoon like shadows lengthening toward evening. By the time Sarah packed up her desk and prepared to leave work, she had reached a conclusion that both terrified and clarified her understanding of the situation. Anna wasn't just inconvenient. She was dangerous, not because of anything she might do but because of what she might represent or remember or know. And Sarah's simple acts of kindness had somehow connected her to that danger in ways she was only beginning to understand. As she walked home through the early twilight, avoiding the square for the first time in weeks, Sarah realized she faced a choice that would define not just her own future, but the kind of person she wanted Noah to see when he looked at his mother. She could accept the warning, retreat into the safety of invisibility, and pretend that Anna Kowalski had never existed. Or she could find out what she had stumbled into by offering bread to a stranger. The decision came to her not as a moment of clarity, but as a slow erosion of the possibility of ignorance. Sarah tried to return to her old routine, walking directly to work without glancing toward the church steps, preparing only enough breakfast for herself and Noah, focusing on the comfortable tunnel vision of someone who minds their own business. But Anna's absence haunted the square like a missing note in a familiar song. 3 days passed without any sign of the woman who had occupied those steps with such careful precision. On Thursday morning as she crossed the square, Sarah noticed something that stopped her mid-stride. There, wedged between the stones where Anna used to sit, was a small piece of gray wool, a fragment of the shawl Anna had worn like armor against the world's indifference. Sarah glanced around the empty square, then quickly retrieved the scrap of cloth. It was damp with morning dew and positioned where someone looking for Anna would be sure to find it. The fabric felt like a message, though from whom and about what remained unclear. That afternoon she made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Instead of going straight home after work, she walked to the library. If Anna Kowalski had lived here long enough to become inconvenient, there might be traces of her existence in the town's records. Mrs. Brennan, the elderly librarian, greeted Sarah with cautious warmth. "I'm looking for information about someone," Sarah said, keeping her voice low. "Anna Kowalski. She might have lived here some time ago." Mrs. Brennan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, suddenly more attentive. "That's not a common name around here. May I ask why you're looking for this person?" "I met her recently and I think she might need help. But she seems to have moved on. I wanted to understand her situation better." After a moment's assessment, Mrs. Brennan nodded toward the back corner where local records were kept. I can let you look through the archives. But I can't help you search. Library policy. Sarah spent 2 hours methodically working through boxes of records, searching for any mention of Anna Kowalski in birth records, property transfers, or newspaper mentions. She found nothing. No Anna Kowalski had ever officially existed in their town's records. But just as Sarah was preparing to give up, she discovered something else in a box of newspaper clippings from 15 years earlier. A small article about a visiting professor at the regional university. Eastern European scholar brings Cold War research to local campus. The accompanying photograph made Sarah's breath catch. The woman was younger, better dressed, clearly situated in a world of academic respectability. But it was unmistakably Anna. The same bone structure, the same intelligent eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera. Dr. Anna Kowalska, the spelling slightly different, was spending a semester as a visiting researcher, working on displaced persons and Cold War refugee policies. She was quoted as saying she hoped her work would shed light on histories that have been deliberately obscured. The photograph showed Anna surrounded by students and faculty who looked at her with respect. It was impossible to reconcile this image with the careful invisibility Anna had maintained on the church steps. 15 years ago, Anna had been a respected scholar. Now she was homeless, deliberately invisible, and apparently dangerous enough that helping her required official warnings. What had happened to transform a visiting professor into someone who existed inconveniently? As Sarah returned the clipping to its folder, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. In the margin, someone had made a small pencil mark next to Anna's name, not casual notation but a deliberate indicator. The mark was recent, the pencil lead dark and sharp, suggesting it had been made within weeks. Someone else had been researching Anna Kowalski's history, someone who had found the same photograph that now burned in Sarah's memory like evidence of a crime she didn't understand. Walking home through the gathering twilight, Sarah felt the weight of discovery settling around her. Anna wasn't just a homeless woman who had fallen through social cracks. She was someone who had once occupied a position of authority, whose research focused on deliberately obscured histories. And now she was gone, leaving behind only a fragment of gray wool and a photograph proving she had once been someone worth paying attention to. The scrap of fabric in Sarah's pocket pulsed with new significance, not just lost clothing, but evidence of a disappearance that might be far more deliberate than she had imagined. That night, as she tucked Noah into bed, Sarah found herself adding a silent plea to his prayers, not for protection, but for the courage to keep asking questions even when the answers might change everything she thought she knew about home. The weekend stretched before Sarah like uncharted territory. For the first time since David's death, she found herself unable to settle into the familiar rhythms of domestic life. Noah's chatter about soccer practice and weekend plans felt distant, filtered through the static of her churning thoughts. She moved through Saturday's errands, grocery shopping, laundry, cleaning, with mechanical precision while her mind circled endlessly around the photograph of Dr. Anna Kowalska. By Sunday afternoon, the weight of unanswered questions had become unbearable. While Noah played with neighborhood children in the small courtyard behind their building, Sarah made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. She would go to the university. The regional campus sat 20 minutes away by bus, a cluster of modern buildings that served the surrounding agricultural communities with practical programs and continuing education. Sarah had never had reason to visit before, but as the bus wound through farmland toward the institutional brick and glass, she felt the strange sensation of approaching answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. The library was open on Sunday afternoons, staffed by student workers who looked barely older than high school graduates. Sarah approached the reference desk with the carefully rehearsed story she had prepared during the bus ride. "I'm researching a paper about visiting scholars from Eastern Europe," she told the young man behind the counter. "Specifically, someone named Anna Kowalska who was here about 15 years ago. Would you have any records from that time period?" The student, his name tag read Marcus, brightened with the enthusiasm of someone grateful for a question more interesting than directions to the bathroom. "Yeah, we should have archived materials from visiting faculty programs. Let me check the digital catalog." Sarah waited as Marcus typed with the confident speed of digital nativity, his fingers flying across the keyboard in ways that made her feel ancient at 34. After several minutes of searching, his expression shifted from confidence to puzzlement. "That's weird," he said, leaning closer to his screen. "I'm seeing references to Dr. Kowalska in several different databases, but when I try to access the actual files, they're showing as restricted or archived beyond standard access." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer would raise more questions than it resolved. Marcus shrugged, but his casual gesture didn't hide the curiosity in his eyes. Usually it means the materials have been moved to secure storage, either because they're too old and fragile for general access, or because there's some kind of legal or administrative hold on them. But 15 years isn't that long ago for academic records. Most of our stuff from that period is still in regular circulation. He turned his screen so Sarah could see the search results. Dozens of entries that referenced Dr. Anna Kowalska's research, her lectures, her interactions with faculty and students. But each entry ended with the same notation: access restricted, contact administrative office. I could try calling the administrative office tomorrow, Marcus offered. Sometimes they just need authorization from a department head or something. Sarah thanked him and spent another hour browsing through general university archives, looking for any trace of Anna that might have escaped whatever systematic removal had eliminated her official presence. She found fragments: a group photograph from a faculty reception where someone matching Anna's description stood at the edge of the frame, a footnote in a professor's published paper thanking Dr. A. Kowalska for her invaluable insights into post-war displacement patterns. But it was clear that someone had worked methodically to erase Anna's academic footprint from the official record. The process had been thorough but not perfect, like trying to remove a person from a tapestry by cutting out every thread that bore their color, leaving small holes that revealed the shape of what was missing. As Sarah waited for the bus back to town, she found herself thinking about the pencil mark in the library's newspaper clipping. Someone else was following the same trail she was walking, someone with enough knowledge to know where to look and enough interest to mark what they found. The thought that she might not be alone in her search should have been comforting, but instead it filled her with a deeper unease. The bus ride home took her through the town's outskirts, past the industrial area where the old textile mills had once provided employment for half the population. Most of the buildings stood empty now, their broken windows like dead eyes watching the slow decay of economic certainty. But as the bus slowed for a traffic light, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip. A figure was walking between the abandoned buildings with purposeful stride, someone wrapped in layers of clothing, moving with the careful awareness of a person who had learned to navigate hostile territory. The distance was too great to be certain, the light too dim for clear identification, but something about the posture, the way of holding shoulders against the world, struck Sarah as achingly familiar. By the time she had processed what she might have seen and moved toward a window for a better view, the bus was pulling away and the figure had disappeared into the maze of empty factories. Sarah pressed her face against the glass, searching the industrial landscape for any sign of movement, but saw only shadows and the gathering darkness of early evening. She told herself she was seeing things, projecting her hopes onto strangers because she needed to believe Anna was alive and safe somewhere beyond the reach of whatever forces had made her disappear from the church steps. But the image lingered with stubborn persistence, adding another layer of uncertainty to questions that already felt too complex for simple answers. That night, as Noah slept peacefully in the next room, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a notebook and tried to organize what she knew into some kind of coherent pattern. Dr. Anna Kowalska, visiting scholar. Anna Kowalski, homeless woman. A photograph, a fragment of cloth, restricted academic records, and now possibly a figure walking through abandoned factories like a ghost returning to haunt the scenes of old crimes. The connections felt significant, but their meaning remained maddeningly elusive, like trying to solve a puzzle when most of the pieces had been deliberately scattered or destroyed. The following morning brought news that transformed Sarah's careful detective work from academic curiosity into something far more urgent. She was preparing Noah's breakfast when her phone rang, an unusual occurrence at 7 in the morning, when most calls brought either emergency or unwelcome obligation. Sarah? The voice belonged to Mrs. Brennan from the library, but it carried a tension Sarah had never heard before. I need you to come in today. Early before we open to the public. There's been an incident. Sarah's stomach dropped. What kind of incident? Someone broke into the library last night, Mrs. Brennan said carefully. Nothing valuable was taken. The computers are all here, the cash box wasn't touched. But the archives section was thoroughly searched. Papers scattered everywhere, filing cabinets opened, boxes emptied. The words hit Sarah like ice water. Did they take anything? That's what I need your help determining, Mrs. Brennan said. You were the last person to access the historical records, and I remember you were looking through the newspaper archives. I need to know exactly which materials you examined so we can figure out what might be missing. Sarah's hands trembled as she finished packing Noah's lunch, her mind racing through implications she didn't want to consider. Someone had broken into the library within days of her research session, targeting the exact section where she had found Anna's photograph. The timing couldn't be coincidental. After dropping Noah at school with promises to pick him up on time and warnings to stay close to his teachers, Sarah hurried to the library. She found Mrs. Brennan waiting by the staff entrance, her usually composed demeanor replaced by something between anger and fear. "I've been working here for 37 years, Mrs. Brennan said as she led Sarah through the building. "We've never had a break-in. Not once. People don't break into libraries to steal books they can check out for free." The archives section looked like a small tornado had touched down with surgical precision. The filing cabinets Sarah had searched stood open, their contents scattered across tables and floor in carefully organized chaos. But it wasn't random destruction. Someone had been looking for specific information with the methodical thoroughness of a professional search. "Show me exactly which boxes you went through," Mrs. Brennan requested, and Sarah retraced her steps from the previous week, identifying each container she had examined in her search for information about Anna Kowalski. As they worked through the scattered papers, a pattern emerged. The materials that remained were exactly what Sarah would have expected to find: routine city records, municipal reports, general newspaper coverage of local events. But there were gaps, spaces where specific items should have been but weren't, absences that became more obvious as they attempted to reconstruct the original filing system. "The newspaper clipping," Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one with the photograph of Dr. Kowalska. It's gone." Mrs. Brennan paused in her sorting, looking up with sharp attention. "You're certain it was here? I read it 3 times. There was a photograph, an article about a visiting professor from 15 years ago. And someone had made a pencil mark next to her name in the margin." Mrs. Brennan's expression shifted, taking on the weight of someone who had just understood that they were dealing with something far more serious than simple vandalism. "Sarah," she said carefully, "I think you need to tell me exactly why you were looking for information about Anna Kowalski." The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Sarah was only beginning to understand. Mrs. Brennan wasn't just asking about research methods or historical curiosity. She was asking whether Sarah understood that her inquiry had somehow triggered events that ended with break-ins and missing evidence. "I met her," Sarah said simply. "She was homeless, living on the church steps. I brought her food for several weeks, and then she disappeared after someone warned me that helping her might cause problems." Mrs. Brennan nodded slowly, as if Sarah's explanation confirmed suspicions she had been harboring. "And now someone has gone to considerable trouble to remove any official record of her academic work from our archives. You think the break-in was connected to my research?" "I think," Mrs. Brennan said, gesturing toward the methodically scattered papers, "that someone is very interested in controlling what information is available about Dr. Anna Kowalska. Interested enough to commit crimes to ensure that certain materials don't remain accessible to people asking questions." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. Her simple act of kindness, her curiosity about Anna's background, had somehow escalated into break-ins and missing records. She was no longer just someone who had helped a homeless woman, she was someone who had stumbled into a story that powerful people wanted to keep buried. "What should I do?" Sarah asked, though she suspected there were no good answers to the question. Mrs. Brennan was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face with the assessment of someone weighing risks against principles. "That depends," she said finally, "on whether you're the kind of person who can pretend this never happened, or the kind who needs to understand what you've gotten yourself into." The choice presented itself with stark clarity. Sarah could walk away, return to her routine, focus on Noah's needs and her own survival in a town where asking the wrong questions apparently carried serious consequences. Or she could acknowledge that Anna Kowalski, Dr. Anna Kowalska, had become more than a stranger she had helped. She had become a mystery that someone was willing to break laws to protect. Outside the library windows, the town looked exactly as it always had: peaceful, predictable, safe. But Sarah was beginning to understand that safety was often just another word for willful blindness, and that some truths couldn't be ignored once you had glimpsed them, no matter how dangerous they proved to be. Sarah's answer came not as words but as a decision that crystallized in her chest like resolve turning solid. "I need to understand," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I can't pretend this never happened." Mrs. Brennan nodded as if she had expected that response, perhaps even hoped for it. "Then we need to be very careful about how we proceed. Whoever searched this library was professional, they knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. That suggests resources and planning that go far beyond local concern." She led Sarah to a small office behind the circulation desk, closing the door with deliberate care. From a locked drawer in her desk, she withdrew a manila folder that looked worn from frequent handling. "I've been librarian here for 37 years, Mrs. Brennan said, opening the folder to reveal photocopied newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. "In that time, you learn to recognize when information is being deliberately suppressed. You also learn to keep copies of things that someone might not want preserved." Sarah stared at the folder's contents, recognizing the newspaper clipping she had found and several others she hadn't seen before. Mrs. Brennan had been conducting her own research into Anna Kowalski's history, documenting a pattern of systematic erasure that went far beyond the previous night's break-in. "This started about 6 months ago," Mrs. Brennan explained, pointing to a timeline she had constructed in careful handwriting. "Someone requested access to all materials related to Eastern European visiting scholars from the past 20 years. Official request, properly authorized, supposedly for a graduate student's dissertation research." She turned to a page of notes that detailed the systematic removal of materials. Over the course of several visits, this graduate student photocopied everything related to Dr. Kowalska's time here, then suggested that the original materials were too fragile for general access and should be moved to secure storage. "Very professional, very thorough, very polite." "But you kept copies," Sarah observed. "I kept copies," Mrs. Brennan confirmed, "because something about the whole process felt wrong. Graduate students don't usually have the authority to recommend archival policies, and the materials weren't fragile. They were being removed because someone didn't want them found by people like you, people asking innocent questions about someone they thought needed help." Sarah studied the documents Mrs. Brennan had preserved, seeing Anna's academic career laid out in newspaper clippings and university announcements. Dr. Anna Kowalska had been far more than a visiting professor. She had been a specialist in Cold War refugee policies, with particular expertise in documenting what had happened to displaced persons who had been quietly relocated by various government agencies during the decades following World War II. Her research was controversial, Mrs. Brennan explained, pointing to a longer article from an academic journal. She was documenting cases where people with inconvenient knowledge, refugees who had witnessed things, survivors who remembered too much, had been relocated not for their own safety, but to keep them quiet. The implications began clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. Anna hadn't just studied displaced persons. She had studied the deliberate displacement of people who knew things that governments preferred to keep buried. And now she herself had become displaced, transformed from respected academic to invisible homeless woman in a way that felt less like personal tragedy and more like systematic silencing. "You think someone relocated her here," Sarah said, understanding dawning with uncomfortable clarity. "Not to help her, but to keep her isolated and quiet. I think Dr. Anna Kowalska learned something that made her dangerous to people with long memories and longer reach," Mrs. Brennan replied. "And I think those people decided that the best way to handle an inconvenient scholar was to make her inconvenient in a different way, homeless, invisible, discredited by circumstances that would make any testimony she might give seem unreliable." Sarah thought of Anna on the church steps, her careful English and precise way of speaking, her dignity maintained despite circumstances that should have broken someone without her education and background. It hadn't been the random cruelty of economic hardship. It had been a deliberate construction, designed to neutralize someone whose knowledge posed a threat. "But if that's true," Sarah said, working through the logic, "then helping her, drawing attention to her situation would threaten the whole arrangement," Mrs. Brennan finished. "Someone went to considerable trouble to transform Dr. Anna Kowalska into a homeless woman that people would ignore. Your kindness was disrupting that invisibility, making her visible again in ways that defeated the entire purpose of her displacement." The warning from Crawford, the pressure at work, the systematic removal of Anna from the church steps. All of it made sense as parts of a larger strategy to maintain the careful balance someone had constructed. Anna's homelessness hadn't been a problem to be solved. It had been a solution to a different problem entirely. "Where is she now?" Sarah asked, though she suspected Mrs. Brennan wouldn't have a simple answer. "I don't know," the librarian admitted. "But I think the real question is whether she's somewhere safe, or somewhere even more invisible than the church steps." The folder contained one more document that Mrs. Brennan had saved for last, a photocopy of a death certificate from a neighboring county, dated just 3 days earlier. The name on the certificate was Anna Kowalski, age and description matching the woman Sarah had known, cause of death listed as exposure and malnutrition. Sarah stared at the document, feeling the world tilt around her like a building settling on unstable ground. "She's dead." According to official records, yes, Mrs. Brennan said quietly. Found in a remote area, no identification, no next of kin. The kind of death that gets recorded and forgotten, filed away with all the other tragedies that happen to people whose lives don't matter to anyone in particular. But even as Sarah absorbed this information, part of her rebelled against its finality. The figure she thought she had seen walking through the abandoned factories, the deliberate placement of the cloth fragment on the church steps. Both suggested someone still alive, still moving through their town's margins with the careful awareness Anna had always displayed. "You don't believe it," Mrs. Brennan observed, reading Sarah's expression with librarian's precision. "I don't know what I believe," Sarah replied. "But I think someone wants us to believe she's dead, and that makes me wonder what she might know that's worth killing for, or worth faking a death to protect." The death certificate felt cold between Sarah's fingers, its official weight contrasting sharply with the questions it raised rather than answered. The bureaucratic language, exposure and malnutrition, reduced Anna's supposed death to administrative categories that erased the complexity of the woman Sarah had known. But something about the timing troubled her more than grief. 3 days ago, Sarah murmured, studying the date. The same week someone broke in here to remove her records. Mrs. Brennan nodded grimly. Either remarkable coincidence or remarkable planning. Clean up the historical record and close the current chapter simultaneously. Sarah thought about the figure she had glimpsed near the abandoned factories, the way it had moved with Anna's particular awareness of being watched. What if the death certificate is part of the cleanup? What if someone decided that the best way to end Anna's story was to end it officially, whether or not it was true? Then she might still be alive, but she'd be trapped in a different kind of invisibility, Mrs. Brennan replied. Dead people can't testify, can't research, can't cause problems for anyone. But they also can't be helped by well-meaning municipal workers who bring them breakfast. The implication settled over Sarah like a lead blanket. If Anna was alive but officially dead, any attempt to help her would require acknowledging that official records were wrong, a position that would invite exactly the kind of scrutiny that had already brought warnings to Sarah's workplace and break-ins to the library. "I have to know," Sarah said, surprised by her own certainty. "I can't live wondering whether I helped kill someone by being kind to them." Mrs. Brennan studied her with the expression of someone weighing a decision that couldn't be unmade. After a long moment, she reached into her desk drawer again and withdrew a small piece of paper with an address written in her careful script. "The death certificate lists the location where the body was found," she said. "Remote area, County Road 47, near the old quarry. If you were the kind of person who wanted to leave flowers or pay respects, you might drive out there and see what you could see." Sarah understood the careful phrasing. Mrs. Brennan was providing information without officially suggesting what Sarah should do with it, maintaining the kind of plausible distance that librarians learn to preserve when dealing with sensitive research requests. "And if I found something that contradicted the official record?" Sarah asked. "Then you'd have to decide whether you're the kind of person who reports discrepancies to proper authorities, or the kind who understands that some proper authorities might not want discrepancies reported." The weight of choice pressed down on Sarah like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Every decision seemed to lead deeper into complexity that could threaten not just her own stability but Noah's security. Yet the alternative, accepting Anna's official death and returning to the comfortable blindness of routine, felt like a betrayal of something fundamental about who she wanted to be. That afternoon, after collecting Noah from school and settling him with homework and cartoons, Sarah made her excuse about needing to run errands and drove toward County Road 47. The route took her through farmland that gradually gave way to scrub forest, the kind of abandoned landscape that existed in the spaces between more profitable uses. The quarry had been closed for decades, leaving behind a deep gouge in the earth that filled with rainwater and local legends about things that couldn't be recovered from its depths. Sarah had never visited the area before, but she found the location referenced in the death certificate without difficulty. A small clearing marked by recent disturbance of the ground and yellow tape that hung limp in the still air. The scene looked exactly as she would expect from reading the official report. Disturbed earth suggested where a body had been found and removed, and the remote location explained why someone could die from exposure without being discovered for days. But as Sarah walked carefully around the periphery of the area, she noticed details that troubled her understanding of what had supposedly happened here. The ground disturbance was too neat, too contained. Someone dying from exposure would have thrashed, moved, left signs of struggle against the cold and hunger that was killing them. But the marks in the earth looked more like someone had been placed there deliberately, arranged with the kind of care that suggested staging rather than natural death. More troubling still were the tire tracks she found 50 yards away, where someone had pulled off the road recently enough that the impressions remained clear in the soft ground. The tracks were deep, suggesting a heavy vehicle, and they showed evidence of careful maneuvering, backing up, adjusting position, the kind of precise movement that suggested deliberate placement rather than emergency response. Sarah photographed everything with her phone, though she wasn't sure what she intended to do with the evidence. The official investigation had been completed, the death certificate filed, the case closed with the efficient finality that bureaucracy brought to inconvenient questions. But the physical evidence suggested a story more complex than exposure and malnutrition. As she prepared to leave, movement in the tree line caught her attention. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure watching from the shadows. Someone wrapped in layers of clothing, standing with the careful stillness of someone accustomed to remaining unnoticed. But when she looked directly toward the spot, there was nothing visible except trees and the shifting shadows of late afternoon. The drive home took Sarah through town via a route she rarely used, past the industrial area where she thought she had glimpsed Anna days earlier. On impulse, she pulled over and walked among the abandoned buildings, looking for any sign of recent occupation. Footprints, disturbed debris, evidence that someone might be sheltering in the empty factories. She found traces that might have been significant or might have been nothing. A small area where old newspapers had been arranged as bedding, a collection of empty food containers that could have been discarded by anyone, scorch marks on concrete that suggested someone had built small fires for warmth. None of it proved anything definitive, but taken together, the signs suggested someone was living rough in the area with the careful minimalism of someone trying not to be discovered. As Sarah returned to her car, she noticed fresh tire tracks in the industrial area too, the same deep impressions she had seen near the quarry, suggesting the same heavy vehicle had visited both locations recently. That evening, as she helped Noah with his homework and listened to his chatter about school friends and weekend plans, Sarah felt the weight of two different lives pressing against each other. In one life, she was a single mother focused on stability and security, someone who minded her own business and avoided complications that could threaten her family's precarious balance. In the other, she was someone who had stumbled onto evidence that an inconvenient scholar might have been murdered and replaced with a death certificate, while the real Anna Kowalski remained hidden somewhere in the margins of their town. The two lives couldn't coexist indefinitely. Eventually, Sarah would have to choose which person she was going to be, and live with the consequences of that choice for the rest of her life. The choice Sarah had been avoiding made itself that night with the inevitability of gravity. She was reading Noah his bedtime story when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stop looking or join her. Some questions don't have safe answers." The message contained no signature, just the cold clarity of a threat delivered with professional precision. Sarah's hands trembled as she finished the paragraph about brave knights, her voice steady despite the fear crystallizing in her chest. After Noah fell asleep, Sarah stared at the phone, rereading the message until the words lost meaning. Someone had her number, knew about her research, understood exactly what she had been investigating. But the message also confirmed what she had suspected: Anna wasn't dead. You couldn't threaten someone with joining a fate that was already final. Sarah's rational mind catalogued reasons she should heed the warning. She had a son who needed her, a job that provided security, a life that worked because it attracted no attention. The smart choice was to delete the message, forget everything about Dr. Anna Kowalska, and return to comfortable blindness. But some choices defined who you were in ways that couldn't be undone. Anna had warned her about consequences that first morning in the square. Now Anna was trapped in an invisibility so complete it included her own death, and Sarah was the only person who seemed to know she was still alive. Sarah spent the night writing a letter she hoped Noah would never need to read, explaining why some things mattered more than safety, why kindness sometimes required courage that felt indistinguishable from stupidity. The letter was insurance against the possibility that the threat wasn't metaphorical. As dawn broke, Sarah made final preparations for a decision that felt both necessary and potentially fatal. She called in sick to work and arranged for Noah to spend the day with her neighbor Mrs. Chen. "Everything okay, dear?" Mrs. Chen asked with gentle concern. "I hope so," Sarah replied, which was both honest and insufficient. The abandoned factory area looked different in morning light, less ominous, more simply empty. But Sarah approached it systematically, documenting everything with photographs she uploaded to cloud storage Noah could access if necessary. The evidence of habitation was extensive. Someone had been living in the old textile mill for weeks, possibly months, with careful minimalism that suggested not homelessness but hiddenness. The arrangement indicated someone with knowledge to create shelter but pressing need to remain undetected. Sarah found clothes drying on improvised lines, books wrapped in plastic, and a camping stove hidden beneath debris. Most significantly, she found academic papers, photocopies of research articles dealing with Cold War refugee policies and government relocation programs. The papers were annotated in handwriting she recognized from the church steps, with comments in multiple languages, English, what looked like Polish, and others she couldn't identify. Someone was continuing scholarly work under impossible conditions. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in plastic, she found a manila folder containing documents that explained why Dr. Anna Kowalska had been transformed from respected academic into officially dead homeless woman. The folder contained correspondence between government agencies, memoranda about problem subjects, and lists of names including Anna's. The documents revealed a program that had continued long past the Cold War's end, dealing with people whose knowledge posed ongoing threats to institutional reputations. Anna hadn't just studied displaced persons. She had identified specific cases where displacement had been used as a weapon against inconvenient truth-tellers. Her research had documented ongoing injustices, getting close enough to current operations to require her own displacement from academic respectability to social invisibility. The folder represented systematic documentation that could destroy careers, end programs, send people to prison, if it reached someone with authority and integrity to act on it. But it also represented evidence that people killed to suppress. The sound of a car door slamming made her heart stop. Through broken windows, she could see a black SUV parked where she had left her car, and figures moving with purposeful efficiency. Sarah had perhaps 2 minutes before they reached her location, 2 minutes to decide whether to run or hide or stand her ground with evidence that could change everything or get her killed. The folder felt simultaneously weightless and impossibly heavy, like holding concentrated truth that someone was willing to commit murder to keep buried. In the distance, she could hear voices calling her name with polite authority of people who already knew exactly where she was and what she had found. The hunt was over. Now came the question of whether the prey had learned anything useful about survival during the brief time she had been free to ask dangerous questions. The voices were getting closer, and Sarah had to choose: run with the evidence and risk never reaching safety, or hide it and hope someone else would eventually find what she had discovered. Either choice could mean never seeing Noah again, but one of them might mean his mother hadn't died for nothing. Sarah's hands moved with desperate efficiency, muscle memory taking over as her mind calculated impossible odds. The voices were perhaps 90 seconds away, close enough that she could distinguish individual tones, professional, unhurried, the sound of people who had done this before and expected no surprises. She couldn't run with the folder and expect to outpace trained professionals in unfamiliar terrain. But she couldn't let the evidence disappear into whatever black hole had swallowed Anna's academic career and nearly swallowed Anna herself. The mill's old machinery provided the answer. A massive textile loom stood against the far wall, its metal housing corroded but intact. Sarah wedged the folder deep into the mechanism, behind gears that hadn't turned in decades, then used her phone to photograph the hiding spot from multiple angles. The images uploaded to cloud storage with agonizing slowness as footsteps echoed in the building's lower level. "Mrs. Patterson?" The voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to finding people in places they shouldn't be. "We know you're here. We'd like to talk." Sarah emerged from behind the machinery with her hands visible, phone tucked safely in her back pocket. 3 figures in dark suits waited at the mill's entrance. 2 men and a woman, all carrying themselves with the particular alertness of federal agents or corporate security contractors. The distinction probably didn't matter at this point. "I was just looking around," Sarah said, aiming for the innocent curiosity of someone who had wandered into private property by mistake. "Old buildings fascinate me." The woman stepped forward with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Agent Morrison, Department of Homeland Security. We understand you've been asking questions about Anna Kowalski." The name hung in the air between them like a test. Sarah noticed they used the anglicized spelling, not the Polish version from Anna's academic work. "I met her on the church steps. I brought her food sometimes. When she disappeared, I wondered what happened to her." "She died," Morrison said with the finality of someone closing a book. "Exposure, malnutrition. Tragic but not uncommon among the homeless population. The death certificate is on file with the county." "I saw it," Sarah replied. "Very thorough paperwork." Morrison's expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, local authorities are quite efficient. Which makes us wonder why you've been visiting locations mentioned in that paperwork, taking photographs, asking questions that suggest you doubt the official findings." The conversation felt like verbal chess, each exchange revealing and concealing information in carefully measured doses. Sarah understood that these people knew exactly what she had been doing, possibly including what she had just hidden in the machinery behind her. But they were still talking rather than acting, which suggested they needed something from her beyond simple silence. "What do you want?" Sarah asked directly, abandoning pretense that had never fooled anyone. "Your cooperation," Morrison said. Anna Kowalski was mentally ill, a former academic who suffered a complete psychological breakdown that left her paranoid and delusional. She believed she was being persecuted by government agencies, that her homelessness was part of some elaborate conspiracy rather than the result of untreated illness. The story was plausible, the kind of explanation that would satisfy anyone who hadn't spent time with Anna, hadn't seen her careful intelligence and precise way of navigating the world. But Sarah had brought Anna breakfast for weeks, had heard her speak with the clarity of someone whose mind worked perfectly despite circumstances that would have broken most people. Unfortunately, Morrison continued, her delusions were contagious. She convinced several well-meaning people that her paranoid fantasies were real, drawing them into elaborate theories about government cover-ups and academic conspiracies. You appear to be one of those people. And if I disagree with that assessment? Morrison's smile became marginally more genuine. Then you'd be demonstrating exactly the kind of delusional thinking that Anna's influence produced. The good news is that such delusions are treatable, especially when the person experiencing them receives proper support and guidance. The threat was elegant in its indirectness: psychological treatment, professional counseling, the kind of therapeutic intervention that could be imposed rather than chosen, especially for someone whose behavior suggested mental instability. Sarah could envision the careful documentation. A single mother, recently bereaved, becoming obsessed with conspiracy theories involving deceased homeless women, requiring residential treatment for her own protection and that of her minor child. "What kind of cooperation are you looking for?" Sarah asked. Simple acknowledgement that Anna Kowalski was a troubled woman who died of natural causes, and that any suggestion otherwise was the product of her illness affecting people who tried to help her. A brief statement for our files, confirmation that you understand the situation correctly, and assurance that you won't continue pursuing fantasies that waste resources and cause unnecessary concern. One of the male agents stepped forward with a tablet and stylus. "We can complete this right now, and then you can return to your normal life without further complications." Sarah looked at the tablet, its screen displaying a formal statement that would officially close the book on Anna Kowalski's life and death. Signing would mean safety for Noah, security for their future, and the comfortable return to invisibility that had protected them since David's death. But it would also mean abandoning Anna to whatever limbo existed between official death and actual survival, and abandoning the evidence hidden in machinery 10 feet away, evidence that documented crimes extending far beyond one inconvenient scholar's forced disappearance. "I need to think about it," Sarah said. Morrison's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Of course. But Mrs. Patterson, I should mention that our conversation today was recorded for quality assurance purposes. If you were to experience any unfortunate accidents or mysterious disappearances, there would be clear evidence that we spoke cordially and that you appeared to be in good mental health when you left here." The implication was crystal clear. They could make her disappear whenever convenient, but they preferred her cooperation to her elimination. For now. Sarah stared at the tablet, its screen glowing with bureaucratic finality. The statement was elegant in its simplicity. A few paragraphs that would transform her from dangerous truth seeker into concerned citizen who had been temporarily misled by a disturbed homeless woman's paranoid delusions. All it required was her signature and her silence. "How long do I have to think about it?" she asked, though she suspected the question itself was being interpreted as resistance. "We're reasonable people, Mrs. Patterson," Morrison replied. "We understand that important decisions require consideration. Shall we say 24 hours? That should give you time to weigh your options carefully." The phrase carried layers of meaning. 24 hours to consider what she valued most. Noah's safety, her own survival, the comfortable illusion that injustice only happened to other people in other places. But also 24 hours during which her cooperation remained voluntary, after which other methods might become necessary. "And Anna?" Sarah asked. "What happens to her in this version of events?" "Anna Kowalski is dead," Morrison said with the patience of someone explaining basic facts to a slow child. "She has been properly buried, her death certificate filed, her case closed. There is no Anna beyond that administrative reality." But Sarah had seen the academic papers in the mill, the careful annotations in Anna's handwriting. Someone was continuing scholarly work in conditions of impossible secrecy, which meant someone was very much alive despite official declarations to the contrary. "I understand," Sarah said, which was true in ways Morrison probably didn't intend. The agents allowed her to leave without escort, though Sarah noticed the black SUV following at a discreet distance as she drove home. The surveillance felt almost casual, the kind of routine monitoring that suggested they expected her compliance rather than her resistance. After all, what could one municipal worker do against resources sufficient to disappear academics and manufacture death certificates? The question haunted Sarah as she collected Noah from Mrs. Chen's apartment, listened to his excited chatter about his day at school, and prepared dinner with the mechanical attention of someone whose mind was elsewhere. She was one person with no special training, no powerful connections, no resources beyond determination and a folder hidden in abandoned machinery. But she was also the only person who knew Anna was alive, the only one who had seen the evidence of ongoing crimes, the only witness to a systematic program of silencing inconvenient voices. The isolation that felt like weakness might actually be a form of strength. She was too small to be worth monitoring carefully, too unimportant to warrant the full attention of people accustomed to dealing with more significant threats. That night, after Noah fell asleep, Sarah made careful preparations for possibilities she hoped wouldn't become necessary. She wrote detailed instructions for accessing the cloud storage account containing her photographs, along with explanations of what Noah should do if she didn't return from errands the following day. The information went into a sealed envelope that she left in their emergency kit, labeled with Noah's name and Mrs. Chen's contact information. She also composed a longer document, a complete account of everything she had learned about Anna Kowalski's transformation from academic to homeless woman to officially deceased person who was apparently still alive and hiding in abandoned buildings. The document included photographs, timelines, and connections between events that painted a picture of systematic persecution disguised as bureaucratic efficiency. The account felt inadequate as she wrote it, too dependent on speculation and circumstantial evidence to convince anyone who hadn't lived through the sequence of discoveries that led to her current understanding. But it was the best insurance she could provide against the possibility that her cooperation with Agent Morrison might become permanently involuntary. As dawn approached, Sarah realized she had been awake all night, sustained by coffee and the clarity that came from understanding she had reached a decision point that would define everything that followed. The 24 hours Morrison had granted weren't really about consideration. They were about giving her time to reach the conclusion that compliance was her only reasonable option. But Sarah had spent weeks learning that reasonable options weren't always the right ones, and that some situations required choices that felt like madness but might actually be the only sane response to an insane reality. She called in sick to work again, arranged for Noah to spend another day with Mrs. Chen, and drove toward the abandoned factory complex where Anna's evidence waited in machinery that hadn't moved since the town's industrial economy collapsed. This time she wasn't going to document and retreat. This time she was going to find Anna herself and learn what was worth hiding in death certificates and threatening text messages. The black SUV appeared in her rearview mirror before she had traveled 2 miles from home, following with the same casual confidence as the day before. But Sarah had spent sleepless hours planning for surveillance, and she took a route that led through the center of town during the morning rush of school buses and commuter traffic. In the organized chaos of parents dropping children at elementary school, Sarah abandoned her car in the school parking lot and continued on foot through neighborhoods she had walked as a child, using shortcuts and backyards and the invisible pathways that connected a small town's secret geography. By the time she reached the factory complex, she was confident she had lost her official escort. The black SUV would be searching for her car, not expecting someone to navigate on foot through residential areas where federal agents would be conspicuous and unwelcome. Now came the harder part. Finding someone who was an expert at remaining unfound, and convincing her that salvation might be possible even when it felt like the most dangerous word in any language. Sarah approached the textile mill with the systematic caution Anna had taught her without meaning to, moving from shadow to shadow, pausing to listen before crossing open spaces, understanding that survival sometimes required thinking like prey. The building looked exactly as she had left it, but she sensed a difference in its emptiness, like the quality of silence that follows recent departure. Inside, the evidence of habitation remained, but it felt arranged rather than lived in. The books were still carefully wrapped, the camping equipment still hidden, but everything had been positioned with the deliberate care of someone preparing to leave quickly if necessary. Anna had been here recently, but she wasn't here now. Sarah retrieved the folder from the machinery where she had hidden it, relieved to find Morrison's people hadn't discovered her improvised cache. The documents felt heavier in daylight, their implications more concrete now that she understood the resources arrayed against anyone who possessed them. But they also felt like the only currency she had for negotiating Anna's safety, and her own. A sound from the upper level froze her attention. Footsteps moving with the careful placement of someone trying not to be heard. Sarah climbed the rusted stairs slowly, each step producing small protests from metal that had been unused for decades. The sound stopped when she paused, resumed when she continued, as if someone above was matching her rhythm to mask their own movement. She found Anna on the top floor, silhouetted against broken windows that looked out over the town where they had both tried to remain invisible in different ways. Anna looked thinner than Sarah remembered, worn by months of hiding, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had recognized danger before Sarah understood it existed. "You shouldn't have come back," Anna said without turning around. "They'll be watching this place now that they know you've been here." "They think you're dead," Sarah replied. "I saw the death certificate." "Yes. Very convenient for everyone." Anna's voice carried the dry irony of someone who had watched her own funeral from a safe distance. "Officially dead people can't testify, can't publish research, can't cause problems for programs that prefer to operate without academic scrutiny." Sarah moved closer, noting how Anna positioned herself to watch the approaches to the building while maintaining their conversation. Even in hiding, she remained the scholar Sarah had glimpsed in newspaper clippings. Someone who observed, analyzed, drew connections that others missed. "I found your research," Sarah said, holding up the folder. "The documents about displacement programs. Is this why they came after you?" Anna's laugh held no humor. "This is why they came after dozens of us. Academics who asked inconvenient questions, journalists who investigated sensitive programs, government employees who kept records they shouldn't have preserved. I'm just the one who was stupid enough to think tenure and academic freedom meant something against institutional self-preservation." She turned from the window, and Sarah could see the toll that months of hiding had taken. Anna had been a respected professor, accustomed to libraries and lecture halls and the comfortable predictability of academic life. Now she lived like a fugitive, constantly alert for dangers that most people couldn't imagine existing in small American towns. "They offered me the same choice they'll offer you," Anna continued. "Cooperation in exchange for safety. Acknowledge that my research was flawed, agree to stop investigating certain programs, accept a quiet retirement with full benefits and no questions asked about my mental health or professional competence. But you refused." "I refused and discovered that refusal transforms you from someone who deserves professional courtesy into someone who poses a security risk. The transition happens gradually. Funding disappears, access to archives gets restricted, colleagues become unavailable for consultation. And then less gradually, your apartment lease isn't renewed, your bank accounts develop mysterious problems, your health insurance claim gets lost in bureaucratic processing errors." Sarah could trace the progression Anna described, the systematic dismantling of someone's official existence until homelessness became the only available option. It hadn't been punishment so much as method, a way of making someone so desperate for basic survival that larger questions about justice became unaffordable luxuries. "The death certificate?" Sarah asked. "Performance art," Anna replied. "They needed to close my case officially, but they also needed to keep me available for monitoring. Dead people can't escape and disappear in other countries, can't reconnect with international colleagues who might ask awkward questions. But officially dead people can be held indefinitely without legal complications." The implications crystallized with sickening clarity. Anna's death was administrative theater, designed to end external interest in her case while maintaining complete control over her actual existence. She was trapped in a liminal space between life and death, invisible to anyone who might help her but perpetually visible to people who wanted her silenced. "What about the evidence?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the folder. "Could this change anything?" "Only if it reaches someone with sufficient authority and integrity to act on it," Anna replied. "And if the person who delivers it survives long enough for the information to be processed through proper channels." Sarah understood the calculation Anna was presenting. The documents were potentially powerful enough to expose systematic crimes and destroy careers, but only if they reached the right people. Getting them to those people would require someone willing to risk becoming the next target for elimination or official death. "They gave me 24 hours to sign a statement," Sarah said. "Acknowledge that you were mentally ill, that your death was natural, that any questions I raised were products of delusional thinking you infected me with." Anna nodded as if she had expected this development. "Standard procedure. They prefer cooperation to elimination, but they're prepared for either outcome. The question is whether you can live with yourself if you sign that statement and return to pretending none of this happened." The question hung between them like suspended weight, carrying the accumulated pressure of every choice that had led Sarah to this moment. She thought of Noah waiting at Mrs. Chen's apartment, trusting that his mother would return from errands that had escalated into something resembling espionage. She thought of the life they had built together through careful invisibility and strategic unimportance. But she also thought of Anna on the church steps, maintaining dignity despite circumstances designed to break her spirit. And she thought of the other names in the folder, other people who had asked inconvenient questions and found themselves transformed from citizens into problems requiring administrative solutions. "If I don't sign," Sarah said, "what happens to Noah?" Anna's expression softened, revealing the teacher she had been before becoming the fugitive she had been forced to become. "That," she said quietly, "is the question they're counting on you to ask. And the reason most people choose cooperation over resistance, even when they know cooperation means abandoning others to the same fate they're trying to avoid for themselves." Outside the broken windows, Sarah could see the town where she had thought she and Noah were safe, where she had believed that minding your own business and avoiding attention would protect you from dangers that happened to other people in other places. But safety, she was beginning to understand, was just another word for willful blindness, and some forms of blindness were purchased with other people's suffering. The weight of choice settled on Sarah like dust from the abandoned mill, covering everything with the gray residue of impossible decisions. Anna watched her with the patient understanding of someone who had faced the same calculation and lived with its consequences. "There's a third option," Anna said quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind through broken windows. "But it requires understanding that sometimes the only way to save your life is to risk losing it completely." Sarah waited, though part of her already knew what Anna was going to propose. "We make the evidence public before they can stop us," Anna continued. "Not through official channels they control, but through journalism, social media, academic networks they can't monitor completely. Create enough noise that silencing us becomes more dangerous than letting us speak." The plan had elegant simplicity and terrifying complexity. Go public with documents that expose systematic persecution of inconvenient scholars, but do it quickly enough to avoid the kind of administrative accidents that had befallen Anna's academic career. Force the story into public consciousness before it could be buried in bureaucratic processing. "What about Noah?" Sarah asked, though she suspected Anna's answer would challenge every assumption she had made about protecting her son. "What about him in 5 years, when they need to silence someone else who asks dangerous questions?" Anna replied. "What about him when he's old enough to wonder why his mother chose comfortable lies over difficult truths? What about the kind of world he inherits if people like us keep choosing safety over justice?" Sarah understood the logic, but logic felt inadequate when weighed against Noah's immediate safety. The black SUV following her that morning represented resources and authority that could make a single mother disappear as efficiently as they had made a tenured professor vanish into official death. "I need guarantees," Sarah said. "Some way to ensure Noah's protected if this goes wrong." Anna's smile was sad and knowing. "The only guarantee I can offer is that doing nothing guarantees they'll keep doing this to other people. Every statement signed, every case closed, every person who chooses silence over resistance makes it easier for them to continue." Through the windows, Sarah could see movement in the distance. Vehicles approaching the factory complex with the systematic coordination of people who had located their target. Morrison's 24 hours had apparently been optimistic. Perhaps signing statements wasn't the only administrative task they intended to complete today. "They're coming," Sarah said, but Anna was already moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared for this possibility. "There's a drainage tunnel beneath this building," Anna said, leading Sarah toward a section of flooring that looked solid but lifted to reveal a narrow opening. "It connects to the stormwater system that runs under the industrial district. I've mapped the entire network during months of hiding." Sarah could hear car doors slamming, voices organizing a search pattern that suggested professional training and extensive experience finding people who didn't want to be found. The folder in her hands felt like both treasure and explosive device. Invaluable evidence that could expose systematic crimes or get them both killed in the next few minutes. "The documents," Anna said, noting Sarah's grip on the folder. "Everything's already been digitized and distributed to multiple secure locations. What you're holding are photocopies, important for verification but not the only copies in existence." The information should have been reassuring, but it raised new questions about Anna's resources and connections. Someone who had been systematically isolated shouldn't have access to secure digital distribution networks or multiple storage locations. "Unless you're not just hiding," Sarah realized. "You're part of something larger." Anna's expression confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect. "There are others," academics, journalists, government employees who kept records they weren't supposed to preserve. People who understand that individual resistance isn't enough against systematic oppression, but coordinated resistance might be sufficient. The voices were closer now, professional and unhurried. Sarah could distinguish Morrison's tone among them, patient and confident in the way of someone who expected no real surprises from the day's work. "Choose," Anna said, gesturing toward the tunnel opening. "Sign their statement and return to the life where you pretend none of this happened, or help us expose what they've been doing and accept the consequences of that choice." Sarah thought of Noah waiting at Mrs. Chen's apartment, trusting that his mother would return from errands that had escalated beyond anything she had imagined when she first brought breakfast to a homeless woman on church steps. She thought of the careful life they had built together, the security that depended on remaining unimportant to people with the power to make problems disappear. But she also thought of the other names in the folder, the systematic pattern of academic careers destroyed and lives erased. She thought of the town that had felt safe because she hadn't understood the dangers that existed just beneath its comfortable surface. "If we do this," Sarah said, "if we make this public, what happens to people like Morrison? People who've been running these programs?" Anna's smile was grim. "That depends on how much noise we can make and how quickly we can make it. But at minimum, they'll have to explain why they've been disappearing scholars and manufacturing death certificates. And explanations have a way of leading to uncomfortable questions about who gave the orders and why." The footsteps were on the mill's ground floor now, systematic and thorough. Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds before they reached the upper level where she and Anna waited beside an opening that led either to escape or deeper danger. She made her choice the way all important choices get made, not through careful analysis of risks and benefits, but through sudden clarity about who she wanted to be when the choosing was over. "Lead the way," Sarah said, and followed Anna into darkness that might lead to safety or might lead to the kind of truth that some people were willing to kill to suppress. Behind them, Agent Morrison's voice called out with professional patience, "Mrs. Patterson, we know you're here. We'd really prefer to finish our conversation above ground." But Sarah was already gone, following someone who had learned to navigate by touch in tunnels that existed beneath the surface of towns that looked peaceful to people who didn't know what questions were too dangerous to ask. The drainage tunnel was narrower than Sarah had expected, forcing them to move in a crouch through darkness that smelled of rust and stagnant water. Anna navigated by memory, her movements confident despite the complete absence of light. Behind them, the sounds of systematic search grew fainter but never disappeared. "They'll find the tunnel entrance eventually," Anna whispered. "But this network extends for miles and they don't know the layout." Sarah's phone provided the only illumination, casting harsh shadows on concrete walls. The battery showed 30%. Enough for navigation but not enough for what they needed to accomplish. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked. "Regional newspaper office," Anna replied. "The editor understands that some stories are too important to kill." The tunnel branched repeatedly, creating a maze Anna navigated without hesitation. They paused at a junction where wider passages suggested they were beneath a major street. Through a grate above, Sarah could see slices of daylight and hear ordinary traffic. People conducting normal business while federal agents searched for two women who had chosen resistance over compliance. "Your phone?" Anna said, noting the fading signal bars. "We need to upload everything now." Sarah's hands shook as she accessed the cloud storage containing photographs of Anna's documents. The upload crawled forward while they remained exposed in a location agents might discover at any moment. "Social media too," Anna instructed. "Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, everywhere information spreads faster than bureaucrats can contain it." The strategy felt simultaneously sophisticated and desperate. They were betting that public exposure would provide protection official channels couldn't guarantee, but ensuring that retreat into comfortable invisibility would no longer be possible. As Sarah's phone completed uploads, Anna's expression changed. She had heard something Sarah missed, a sound that didn't belong. "They're in the system," Anna said simply. "Faster than I expected." Voices echoed through passages they had traversed minutes earlier, growing closer with systematic inevitability. Morrison's people had included someone familiar with urban infrastructure. 20 minutes through tunnels, 5 minutes if we surface and risk exposure," Anna replied to Sarah's unspoken question. "But surfacing means cameras, facial recognition, electronic tracking." Before Sarah could respond, Anna was moving again, leading them through progressively narrower passages until they reached what appeared to be a dead end. But Anna's hands found hidden mechanisms, levers and catches suggesting regular maintenance. A section of wall swung inward, revealing deliberately constructed space containing communication equipment, supplies, and organized efficiency that suggested regular use. Underground Railroad, Anna explained. Not the historical kind, but serving similar purposes. Academics, journalists, whistleblowers, people who need to disappear temporarily while information gets processed through channels that can't be monitored. Anna activated communication equipment with practiced familiarity, establishing connections that bypassed traditional telecommunications. Within minutes, voices responded from locations across the country. Package is ready for delivery, Anna spoke into modified radio equipment. Multiple recipients, maximum distribution, coordinated release in 30 minutes. The response came immediately, confirmed. Security protocols active. Extraction team deployed to your location. Sarah realized Anna's plan was far more sophisticated than simply making noise through social media. The documents would be released simultaneously through multiple channels: newspapers, academic journals, government oversight committees, international human rights organizations, creating coordinated exposure impossible to suppress through normal administrative means. But coordination required precise timing, and timing required staying alive long enough for completion. Approaching footsteps echoed through passages they had abandoned, closer now and moving with increased urgency. Morrison's team had realized their quarry wasn't simply hiding but actively working toward objectives beyond personal survival. 10 minutes, Anna said, monitoring communications from the network preparing to expose systematic crimes. We need to hold this position for 10 minutes, and then none of this can be undone. Through the hidden room's ventilation, Sarah could hear vehicles arriving above ground. More resources being deployed as whoever controlled Morrison realized they faced coordinated resistance rather than isolated individuals manageable through routine intimidation. Sarah thought of Noah waiting at Mrs. Chen's apartment, trusting his mother would return from errands that had escalated into something resembling espionage. She thought of the careful life they had built together through strategic invisibility. But she also thought of the other names in the folder, the systematic pattern of careers destroyed and lives erased. Some choices defined who you were in ways that couldn't be undone. The next 10 minutes would determine whether resistance had been brave or simply fatal, and whether Noah would inherit a world where asking dangerous questions carried consequences extending beyond academic careers into matters of life and officially recorded death. Outside their hiding place, footsteps grew closer, and Sarah gripped Anna's hand as they waited to discover whether truth was stronger than the institutional power arrayed against it. The footsteps stopped directly above them, close enough that Sarah could distinguish individual voices through the ventilation grate. Morrison's professional patience had evaporated, replaced by the clipped efficiency of someone operating under pressure from superiors who demanded immediate results. Seal the sector, Morrison ordered. Every tunnel entrance, every storm drain, every utility access within a 6-block radius. They're down there and they're not leaving until we have them. Anna's fingers moved across the communication equipment with desperate precision, monitoring countdown timers that marked the distance between their current predicament and coordinated document release. 7 minutes remaining until information reached distribution networks that couldn't be recalled or suppressed. Extraction Team ETA? Anna whispered into the radio. 4 minutes to your position, came the response. But we're seeing heavy federal presence above ground. This is going to be complicated. Sarah understood that complicated was professional understatement for a situation that had escalated beyond simple academic persecution into something resembling urban warfare conducted through bureaucratic channels. Whatever program Anna had been investigating, it commanded resources sufficient to lock down entire city blocks without official explanation. Through the hidden room's walls, they could hear systematic progress, teams moving through tunnel networks with electronic equipment that eliminated the advantages of darkness and familiarity Anna had counted on. Professional hunters with professional tools, closing in on prey who had run out of places to hide. 5 minutes, Anna said, watching displays that tracked document uploads to servers around the world. If we can hold for 5 more minutes, none of this can be stopped. But 5 minutes felt like geological time when measured against the sound of approaching voices, the systematic elimination of escape routes, the growing certainty that their hiding place would be discovered before protection could arrive. Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications as the documents began appearing on social media platforms, academic networks, and news websites. She watched in real time as information spread beyond the reach of administrative suppression. Retweets, shares, comments from journalists and activists who recognized the significance of what they were seeing. It's working, Sarah whispered, watching engagement numbers climb with exponential momentum. People are seeing this. Anna nodded grimly. The question is whether they're seeing it fast enough. Once this information reaches critical mass, we become more valuable alive than dead, potential witnesses rather than problems requiring elimination. But until that happens. The sentence finished itself as sounds of discovery echoed through nearby passages. They had been located with the systematic efficiency Anna had feared, found by people who understood that some secrets were worth killing to preserve. Movement in the tunnels, voices reported through official radio channels Sarah could now hear clearly. 2 subjects, armed with communications equipment, requesting authorization for enhanced intervention protocols. Morrison's response carried the weight of someone making decisions that would be difficult to explain in after-action reports. Authorization granted. Priority is preventing information transmission, not subject preservation. The words transformed their situation from manhunt into something more desperate. They were no longer being pursued for questioning or administrative processing, but for the kind of permanent silence that left no inconvenient witnesses to complicate official narratives. Anna's equipment registered final confirmations from distribution networks around the world. Documents were now embedded in systems that couldn't be recalled, information flowing through channels that operated beyond the reach of domestic law enforcement. The revelation was complete, irreversible, and spreading with viral momentum that would make individual elimination pointless. Done, Anna said with quiet satisfaction. Whatever happens to us now, the story is out there. Multiple copies, multiple languages, multiple jurisdictions. They can't undo what we've accomplished. The accomplishment felt simultaneously triumphant and inadequate as footsteps approached their final hiding place. Sarah thought of Noah waiting at Mrs. Chen's apartment, trusting that his mother would return from errands that had become a choice between comfortable lies and dangerous truths. Extraction team in position. The radio crackled. Emergency protocols active. Prepare for immediate departure. Before Sarah could ask what that meant, explosions echoed through tunnels they had recently traversed, not the destructive kind, but concussive charges designed to create confusion and provide cover for movement. Smoke began filtering through ventilation systems as professional chaos replaced systematic search patterns. Anna was already moving, gathering equipment with practice speed while monitoring communications from people who had apparently been preparing for exactly this kind of emergency. Sarah followed, understanding that they were transitioning from hiding to escape, from passive resistance to active extraction by networks that existed specifically to protect people whose knowledge made them targets. Through passages filling with smoke, guided by voices that spoke in tactical abbreviations and coordinate systems, they moved toward what Anna called surface protocols, procedures designed to transform hunted academics into protected witnesses before bureaucratic elimination could be completed. Behind them, Agent Morrison's voice cut through radio chatter with professional frustration. Subjects have institutional support. Repeat, subjects have institutional support. This is no longer a simple containment operation. The acknowledgement marked a boundary they had crossed without recognizing its significance. They were no longer isolated individuals who could be managed through routine intimidation, but part of coordinated resistance that commanded resources sufficient to challenge federal authority directly. Sarah emerged from underground darkness into daylight that felt like revelation, breathing air that didn't smell of rust and fear. Around them, people moved with the organized efficiency of a plan that had been rehearsed but never fully implemented until this moment. Journalists, lawyers, activists who understood that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The story was out, spreading beyond the reach of administrative suppression, and Sarah was alive to witness what happened when comfortable lies collided with dangerous truths in broad daylight. The safe house was an unremarkable suburban home, but the electronic equipment behind ordinary furnishings and the systematic way their escorts checked sight lines suggested resources extending far beyond Anna's academic support network. 67 news outlets have picked up the story in 4 hours, reported a woman introducing herself only as Jennifer, fingers moving across screens displaying real-time media coverage. International attention is building, BBC, Deutsche Welle, Al Jazeera. The State Department is receiving inquiries from academic freedom organizations in 12 countries. Sarah watched her small-town investigation transform into headlines using words like systematic persecution and state-sponsored intimidation. The story had acquired momentum beyond anything she'd imagined when bringing breakfast to a homeless woman on church steps. Morrison's people? Anna asked. Recalled to Washington for consultation, Jennifer replied with satisfaction. Official story is routine reassignment, but sources suggest someone senior is asking uncomfortable questions about how a homeless death investigation escalated into international incident. Through windows, Sarah saw ordinary suburban afternoon, children returning from school, neighbors retrieving mail, comfortable rhythms continuing despite revelation of systematic crimes occurring beneath their surface. It felt surreal witnessing normal existence while understanding how many people had been disappeared from similar neighborhoods through administrative efficiency. Her phone rang. Mrs. Chen. Noah's asking when you're coming home. Mrs. Chen's voice carried concern beyond simple babysitting. There are men asking questions about you. Professional-looking men claiming routine security checks. Sarah's stomach clenched. Going public hadn't eliminated personal danger but changed its character. They couldn't make her disappear quietly, but could still apply pressure through people she cared about most. Tell Noah I'm fine and I'll be home soon, Sarah said, hoping the promise wasn't empty. If those men return, don't answer questions without a lawyer. This is more complicated than it appears. Anna monitored multiple news feeds, tracking how their revelation was received. Academic institutions called for investigations, civil liberties organizations demanded hearings, international observers questioned American academic freedom. Coverage is good, Anna observed, but coverage isn't accountability. Stories fade, people forget, administrative procedures continue below public attention until the next revelation makes headlines. Jennifer looked up with an expression suggesting she'd been waiting for this conversation. That's why we don't stop with exposure. Documentation is phase 1. Phase 2 ensures systematic change, preventing this from happening to others. Jennifer outlined what their networks had planned for months, not simply revealing individual persecution cases, but documenting patterns demonstrating institutional policies designed to silence academic inquiry into sensitive government programs. They'd been collecting evidence from dozens of cases, building comprehensive documentation, making isolated explanations impossible. You were never the target, Jennifer explained to Sarah. You were the catalyst. Someone whose involvement would demonstrate this program extends beyond academic institutions into ordinary communities, affecting people who never intended to challenge authority but got drawn into resistance through simple human decency. Sarah understood she'd been recruited unknowingly, her investigation guided toward discovery serving purposes larger than Anna's individual case. But this manipulation felt different from Morrison's people. Oriented toward exposure rather than suppression, accountability rather than elimination. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now we testify, Anna replied. Congressional hearings, academic review boards, international human rights tribunals. We tell our stories publicly and repeatedly until institutional changes become inevitable. The prospect felt overwhelming, transforming from small-town municipal worker into public figure whose testimony could influence national and international policy. But retreat was no longer possible. Comfortable invisibility had been traded for visibility carrying both protection and permanent responsibility. Sarah's phone buzzed with notifications from news outlets requesting interviews, academic institutions offering support, advocacy organizations extending speaking invitations. The transformation from private citizen to public witness happened with exhilarating and terrifying speed. Noah, Sarah said simply, expressing the concern overshadowing everything else. Jennifer's smile carried understanding, suggesting she'd helped other parents navigate similar transitions. Protection extends to family members. More importantly, publicity makes traditional elimination methods impossible. They can't make witnesses disappear when those witnesses are scheduled for televised testimony next week. Through windows, Sarah saw news vans arriving in the previously quiet neighborhood, reporters setting up equipment that would broadcast their location worldwide. The revelation had transformed from underground resistance into public spectacle, from hidden truth into unavoidable reality demanding institutional response. Anna squeezed Sarah's hand with wordless gratitude. You chose truth over safety. Most people choose safety. But you chose truth, and that choice changed everything for people you'll never meet who were facing the same systematic persecution we survived. Outside, camera crews prepared for broadcasts that would carry their story into living rooms across the country, transforming academic freedom from abstract principle into concrete reality measured in individual lives. Sarah thought of Noah, who would grow up understanding his mother chose resistance over compliance when faced with injustice too systematic to ignore. It wasn't the comfortable legacy she'd planned, but it was honest in ways comfortable legacies often weren't. The next phase of resistance was beginning in full daylight, with witnesses, cameras, and accountability extending beyond administrative convenience into democratic responsibility. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in a congressional hearing room that felt like a cathedral of American democracy, high ceilings, polished wood, and the weight of institutional authority that had seemed so intimidating when she first encountered it through Morrison's presence. Now, flanked by lawyers from civil liberties organizations and surrounded by journalists whose coverage had transformed her testimony from personal account into national conversation, the intimidation felt different. Not absent but manageable. "Mrs. Patterson," the committee chair began, his voice carrying the formal courtesy reserved for witnesses whose stories had already changed public opinion, "please describe for the record how you first encountered Dr. Anna Whitman." Sarah's answer was practiced but not rehearsed, refined through multiple interviews but retaining the emotional truth that had driven her from comfortable invisibility into this spotlight. She described the homeless woman on church steps, the investigation that had seemed routine until it revealed systematic persecution, the choice between signing statements that would restore her quiet life or pursuing truth that demanded public accountability. Behind her in the gallery, Noah sat with Mrs. Chen, watching his mother testify about events that had transformed their family's existence in ways he was still too young to fully understand. The protection Jennifer had promised extended beyond physical security into educational opportunities and support networks that would help him navigate the complexities of having a mother whose conscience had made her famous. Anna, testifying from a secure location via video connection, provided the academic context that gave Sarah's personal experience broader significance. Her research documented not just her own case but patterns affecting dozens of scholars whose questions about government programs had made them targets for administrative elimination. The system operates through bureaucratic mechanisms that appear legal and reasonable when examined individually, Anna explained to the committee. Funding disappears due to budget constraints. Access gets restricted for security reasons. Housing becomes unavailable through market forces. Each step seems like unfortunate coincidence until you recognize the pattern repeated across multiple cases. The congressman from Massachusetts, whose questions had been particularly sharp, leaned forward with visible anger. "Dr. Whitman, are you telling this committee that federal agencies have been systematically destroying academic careers to prevent research into sensitive programs?" "I'm telling you that my research documented this pattern across multiple institutions and multiple years," Anna replied with academic precision. "Whether it represents systematic policy or systematic failure of oversight is a distinction this committee will need to determine." Sarah watched the political theater with fascination and growing understanding of how individual stories became institutional change. Her testimony had provided emotional resonance that made abstract policy discussions concrete and personal. Anna's research had provided documentation that made denial impossible. Together, they had created momentum for reforms that would affect people they would never meet. But the victory felt incomplete. Morrison and his immediate supervisors had been reassigned, not prosecuted. The programs Anna had investigated continued operating under modified protocols that addressed public criticism without fundamentally changing institutional authority. People who had given orders remained in positions where they could give different orders that achieved similar results through methods that hadn't yet attracted public attention. "Mrs. Patterson," the ranking minority member asked, his tone suggesting skepticism about government accountability measures being discussed, "what assurance do you have that your testimony today will result in meaningful change rather than cosmetic adjustments that allow these practices to continue in modified form?" Sarah had anticipated the question through conversations with advocates who had fought similar battles for decades. "I don't have assurance," she replied honestly. "What I have is the understanding that silence guarantees these practices will continue unchanged, while speaking out creates the possibility for accountability even if that possibility isn't guaranteed." Her answer carried the weight of choice that had defined every step of her journey from municipal worker to congressional witness. Perfect outcomes weren't available, but better outcomes were possible through resistance that acknowledged uncertainty while refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. After the hearing, Sarah walked down the Capitol steps with Noah's hand in hers, surrounded by reporters whose questions had become routine and lawyers whose protection had become necessary but no longer felt extraordinary. The transformation from private citizen to public figure was complete, irreversible, and had changed not just their circumstances but their understanding of citizenship itself. "Mama," Noah asked with the directness of childhood, "are the bad people going to jail?" Sarah considered the question with the complexity it deserved. Some bad people would face consequences: career damage, public embarrassment, political inconvenience. Others would adapt, finding new methods for achieving objectives that hadn't fundamentally changed. The victory was partial, temporary, and would require continued vigilance from people who understood that institutional change happened gradually through sustained pressure rather than dramatically through single revelations. Some of them, Sarah told her son. And more importantly, other people who might become bad people will know that someone is watching, someone is willing to speak out, someone cares enough to resist when resistance becomes necessary. It wasn't complete justice, but it was progress measured in lives that wouldn't be destroyed, questions that could be asked, research that could proceed without scholars fearing for their survival. Anna remained in protective custody pending additional hearings, but she was alive, visible, and able to continue work that had been interrupted but not eliminated. As they walked toward Union Station and the train that would take them home to a town that would never feel quite the same, Sarah understood that her choice had created obligations extending beyond personal safety into ongoing responsibility for protecting institutions that made such choices possible. The resistance had succeeded, partially and temporarily, and would need to succeed again whenever institutional power forgot that accountability was the price of democratic legitimacy. 6 months after the hearings, Sarah's life had settled into a new kind of normal that bore little resemblance to the quiet existence she had built before Anna Whitman appeared on church steps. The municipal job was gone, not through official termination but through the kind of budget restructuring that made her position redundant without creating actionable grievances. But other opportunities had emerged. Speaking engagements at universities where faculty wanted to understand how institutional persecution operated in practice. Consulting work with advocacy organizations that needed someone who could translate bureaucratic intimidation into language ordinary people could recognize. A book contract that would transform her testimony into accessible narrative for readers who had never considered how easily democratic institutions could be corrupted. The advance will cover Noah's college fund and then some, Sarah told Anna during one of their monthly video calls, grateful that the protection networks had evolved to allow secure communication between witnesses whose safety still required careful management. Funny how nearly getting disappeared can become a career opportunity if you survive the experience. Anna's laugh carried the dark humor of someone whose academic career had been destroyed but whose research had ultimately reached audiences far larger than any traditional publication could have achieved. My graduate students send me updates on how the investigation has affected their own work. Apparently, asking difficult questions about government programs is considered fashionable now, at least in certain academic circles. The cultural shift was subtle but measurable. Journalists investigated bureaucratic patterns more aggressively. Academic institutions implemented stronger protections for researchers whose work touched sensitive subjects. Government oversight committees paid closer attention to programs that operated below public scrutiny. The changes weren't revolutionary, but they represented progress toward accountability that hadn't existed before their resistance. Noah had adapted to their transformed circumstances with the resilience of childhood, though Sarah sometimes caught him watching news coverage with an intensity that suggested he understood more about their situation than his age should require. The protection protocols had become routine. Checking for surveillance using secure communication methods, maintaining awareness of who was paying attention to their activities and why. "Do you ever miss the old life?" he asked one evening as they reviewed his homework together in the apartment that had replaced their house when staying in one location became inadvisable. Sarah considered the question with the honesty she had learned to practice since choosing truth over comfortable lies. "I miss feeling safe," she admitted. "But I don't miss not knowing what kind of world we were living in." Ignorance felt like safety, but it wasn't real safety. Real safety requires understanding what threatens the things you care about. The congressional hearings had led to limited reforms. Oversight committees with broader authority, whistleblower protections with stronger enforcement mechanisms, bureaucratic procedures that required more documentation and review before academic funding could be eliminated or access restricted. But Sarah had learned enough about institutional power to understand that such reforms were always temporary, always vulnerable to modification when public attention moved elsewhere. "Mrs. Patterson?" The voice belonged to a young journalist Sarah recognized from various hearings and conferences, someone whose coverage had been consistently accurate and sympathetic. "I'm working on a follow-up story about the long-term impact of your testimony. Could we speak briefly?" They met at a coffee shop that had become their informal office, a public place where conversations could occur without suggesting secret meetings but private enough that sensitive topics could be discussed without attracting unwanted attention. The journalist, Maya something, Sarah still struggled with remembering names from her new professional network, had questions about sustainability. "The reforms look impressive on paper," Maya observed, "but advocates I've spoken with worry about implementation. Whether these changes will survive the next administration, the next budget crisis, the next security emergency that creates pressure to prioritize efficiency over accountability. Sarah had worried about the same issues, understanding that their victory was fragile and would require ongoing vigilance from people who cared more about democratic principles than administrative convenience. "That's why the story can't end with congressional hearings," she replied. "Institutional change requires institutional memory, and institutional memory requires people who keep telling the story even after it stops being news." The responsibility felt heavier than the recognition it brought. Speaking fees and book advances were helpful, but they came with obligations to remain visible, available, and committed to conversations she sometimes preferred to avoid. Comfortable privacy was no longer possible, not because of government surveillance but because of public expectation that she would continue representing principles that extended beyond her individual case. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. "New case developing in Oregon. Academic researching surveillance programs, similar pattern to Anna's situation. Interested in consultation?" Sarah stared at the message, understanding that it represented choice between resuming something resembling normal life or accepting permanent responsibility for protecting people whose situations resembled what hers had been 6 months earlier. The resistance hadn't ended with their survival. It had created precedent and networks that made future resistance more possible but also more necessary. She thought of Noah, who deserved a mother focused on his childhood rather than consumed by institutional battles that might continue for years. But she also thought of other children whose parents might face persecution for asking questions that made powerful people uncomfortable, and the world those children would inherit if such persecution continued without resistance. "Yes," Sarah typed back to Jennifer. "Send me the details." The choice felt familiar: truth over safety, accountability over comfort, active citizenship over passive acceptance of injustice. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was the life that choosing conscience over convenience had created, and she found herself surprisingly grateful for the opportunity to make such choices matter. Outside the coffee shop, ordinary life continued with the comfortable rhythms she had once taken for granted. But now she understood those rhythms as achievements that required protection rather than assumptions that would maintain themselves, and protection required people willing to resist when resistance became necessary. The story continued, with different characters facing similar choices, and Sarah had become someone who helped write endings where conscience triumphed over institutional pressure to remain silent. 2 years after the hearings, Sarah stood before a packed Northwestern University auditorium, delivering her presentation on institutional accountability. The audience, graduate students, faculty, activists, understood that the principles at stake extended beyond academic freedom into democratic oversight of powerful institutions. "The most dangerous moment isn't when they come for you directly," Sarah explained. "It's when they create systems that make resistance seem impossible. When people believe individual action can't challenge institutional power, that's when power becomes truly dangerous." Noah, now 12, listened from the front row with focused attention. He'd grown up understanding his mother's work carried real consequences. Protection protocols had relaxed, but certain precautions remained routine. After the presentation, Dr. Rebecca Martinez approached, a climate scientist whose research funding had been terminated after publishing papers questioning government-subsidized energy projects. The pattern was familiar. Funding disappeared, facility access restricted, colleagues avoided collaboration. Systematic isolation without obvious legal targets. "Do you have documentation?" Sarah asked, understanding this was always the first requirement. Dr. Martinez produced correspondence and records telling the familiar story of administrative pressure applied through seemingly routine channels. The evidence was solid, compelling to audiences sensitized by previous cases. "The question isn't whether you have grounds for resistance," Sarah observed. "It's whether you're prepared for what resistance involves: legal challenges, media attention, threats, fundamental life changes. It's not a choice you make partially." Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. Colleagues who stayed quiet hoping pressure would pass discovered that silence doesn't provide protection. It just makes elimination less visible. Sarah outlined resources developed since her case: legal organizations, advocacy networks, protection protocols. The infrastructure for resistance had become sophisticated, but so had institutional methods for avoiding accountability. That evening, Sarah called Anna, who now worked with international human rights organizations monitoring academic freedom globally. "Another climate scientist," Sarah reported. "Same pattern, different subject. The system is adapting." Anna's voice carried weariness. "They can't make tactics invisible without making them less effective. But they can make each case require starting from scratch." Their conversation turned to Noah, managing adolescence under circumstances that complicated normal teenage experiences. Sarah worried about the impact, but recognized he was learning citizenship lessons most people never encountered. He asked whether what we did was worth the cost, not just for us but specifically for him. Whether we had the right to change his life so dramatically. Anna was quiet, understanding the weight. What did you tell him? The truth. That I don't know if we had the right, but I know we had the responsibility. Some choices define who you are beyond personal consequences. He'll make similar choices someday, and I wanted him to understand it's possible even when difficult. Dr. Martinez decided to move forward with formal complaints and media coverage. Another case requiring months of sustained attention for partial justice and temporary reform. Sarah understood this was her life now, helping people navigate persecution, building resistance networks, speaking about principles requiring constant defense. Not the quiet existence she treasured, but meaningful work connecting individual conscience to institutional accountability. The pattern would continue: new persecution cases, new resistance forms, new institutional adaptations requiring new strategies. Democratic institutions required constant maintenance by people willing to resist when necessary. As Sarah prepared to return home, Jennifer messaged, "Congressional committee requesting your testimony on proposed funding oversight reforms. Interested?" The work continued. Each testimony and successful case created precedent, making future resistance more possible while also more necessary. Sarah had become part of infrastructure maintaining democratic accountability, grateful for the opportunity to serve principles larger than personal comfort. Outside her hotel window, Chicago's morning traffic moved with ordinary rhythms. People conducting normal business, unaware that their ability to do so depended partly on people like Sarah resisting when institutional power forgot its democratic obligations. 3 months later, Sarah watched Noah graduate middle school with the quiet pride of a mother who had chosen truth over safety and found that choice had created not just personal meaning but institutional change. Dr. Martinez's case had resulted in congressional investigations, policy reforms, and protection protocols that would benefit researchers she would never meet. The resistance had become a way of life, and that life had proven more meaningful than the safety it replaced. Democracy required constant vigilance, and Sarah had learned to find satisfaction in providing that vigilance through individual courage that inspired institutional accountability. In the audience, Anna sat beside them, no longer in hiding, her research continuing under new auspices that prioritized truth over administrative convenience. The systematic persecution hadn't ended, but systematic resistance had made it more difficult, more visible, more costly for those who attempted it. The choice to resist had transformed 3 lives and countless institutions. It was enough.